Emily Johnson stood in the courtroom, accused of a crime she didn't commit. Then, with one calm statement, she revealed a shocking flaw in the evidence that no one had noticed. The prosecutor went pale. The room went silent. What happened next changed everything. You won't believe how it all unraveled. But let's start from the beginning. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Emily Johnson, a 17-year-old high school senior, stood in the courtroom, her heart racing but her face betraying no emotion. The tension was palpable, and the room was filled with the heavy weight of expectation. Emily had been accused of cyberbullying her classmate, a case that seemed like a clear-cut story of a troubled teen lashing out online. The evidence against her seemed irrefutable. Text messages, screenshots, and testimony from other students painted her as the instigator, the villain in a digital attack that had pushed the victim to the brink. At the center of it all was Judge Thomas Miller, a man known for his unflinching demeanor. His expression was stern, unreadable, and the case before him seemed more like a formality than a battle for truth. The prosecution, led by Mr. Thompson, a sharp and experienced attorney, had already presented a damning argument. He spoke with conviction, confident that this case was as good as won. Emily's defense attorney, a weary figure who had been trying, unsuccessfully, to find any cracks in the prosecution's case, had little hope left. The witnesses had spoken, the evidence had been presented, and the public perception had already condemned her. As Emily sat in the witness box, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze shifted from the judge to the jury. The weight of their stares pressed down on her, and a wave of helplessness washed over her. How had it all gone so wrong? How had the truth become something so distorted, so twisted? For a moment, she almost felt like giving in to the pressure, letting the system swallow her whole. But then, something in her snapped. With a deep breath, she raised her hand. The room fell deathly silent. All eyes were on her, waiting. The judge, surprised by the interruption, narrowed his eyes. "Miss Johnson?" he asked, his voice firm but tinged with curiosity. "Your Honor," Emily began, her voice steady and clear, betraying none of the fear that gripped her insides. "I'd like to make a motion before we proceed." The words hung in the air, charged with tension. The judge paused, his expression unreadable, and the murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Was she really about to do this? Was she about to stand up and challenge the course of the trial with nothing more than a few words? For a brief moment, Emily felt the eyes of the entire courtroom bore into her. The air seemed to thicken, the anticipation growing with each second that passed. She had no idea how this would play out, no idea whether her gamble would pay off. All she knew was that she couldn't let this happen without at least trying to correct the course. "Your Honor," she said again, this time more firmly, "I'm not guilty, and I can prove it." The words hit the room like a bombshell, shaking everyone to their core. Emily's statement was not just a plea for mercy, it was a declaration, a challenge to the very narrative that had been set in stone. The prosecutor's face twisted in disbelief, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what had just been said. Her defense attorney blinked, clearly taken aback, and the jury exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the sudden turn of events. Emily didn't flinch. She held her ground, knowing that her words had just created a crack in the foundation of the case. She had no idea how it would unfold, but she was no longer going to sit back and accept what was happening. The fight had just begun. As the judge leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her, Emily took a deep breath. What she said next would either seal her fate or set everything in motion. She wasn't sure which, but she was ready to face whatever came next. And so was the courtroom. Judge Miller stared at Emily, his brow furrowed in annoyance. "Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "You know this is highly irregular. But go ahead. Emily didn't flinch. She had known the risks of what she was about to do, but she was prepared. The entire case had been built on digital evidence, messages, screenshots, and timestamps, yet none of it made sense to her. Something wasn't right. If she could expose that flaw, it could all fall apart. Taking a deep breath, she began, her voice steady, controlled, but unwavering. The timestamps on the messages don't match the actual server logs, she said, projecting her words so they echoed across the courtroom. She didn't look at the prosecutor or her defense attorney. She kept her eyes on the judge, whose expression was now a mix of disbelief and confusion. I can prove this with an expert witness. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the courtroom. The defense attorney, sitting beside her, froze. He hadn't caught that discrepancy. None of them had. The prosecutor, Mr. Thompson, shifted in his seat, his gaze hardening. Emily had just identified a crack in the seemingly impenetrable case against her. Judge Miller hesitated for the first time. He glanced briefly at the prosecution's table, his face tightening. This wasn't supposed to happen. Emily was a teenager, a defendant without much legal experience. How could she have found something that no one else had noticed? The room, once thick with the certainty of Emily's guilt, shifted. The tension in the air was palpable. People were starting to question the evidence. Could this young girl, under the harshest scrutiny, really be right? Was it possible that the system, the prosecution, even her own defense attorney had missed something so fundamental? Emily didn't allow herself to get lost in the growing uncertainty. She kept her voice calm, her posture firm. She wasn't here to impress anyone or to gain sympathy. She was here to expose the truth, nothing more, nothing less. Mr. Thompson's jaw tightened. He looked at the judge, then back at Emily, a flicker of unease passing through his eyes. "Your Honor," he began, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "This is nothing more than a delay tactic." Emily didn't flinch. She had expected this. Of course, the prosecution would try to discredit her, but it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted. Even if they dismissed her motion, the damage had been done. Judge Miller's eyes narrowed, and the room fell into an awkward silence. The judge was no longer certain of his next move. His usual stern composure wavered, a crack forming in the confidence that had held the trial together up until now. The audience, once silent in their conviction of Emily's guilt, was now filled with whispers. Could she really be telling the truth? Was it possible the entire case was based on flawed evidence? The weight of doubt had crept in, and Emily could feel the shift. The jury's gaze had softened, their expressions uncertain. They were no longer sure of what to believe. For a brief moment, Emily allowed herself a quiet breath, but there was no relief. The road ahead would still be long, and she didn't know where it would lead. She had just opened a door, but the consequences of what lay behind it were unknown. What if the expert witness she had referred to couldn't corroborate her claim? What if the court decided to overlook her motion entirely? Still, as the judge stared at her, Emily knew one thing for certain. She had changed the game. She had made them doubt, and that was the first step in finding the truth. Judge Miller finally broke the silence. "We'll take a brief recess," he announced, his voice tight but resigned. As he stepped off the bench, the courtroom erupted into muted conversations. Emily remained seated, her heart still pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. She had done what she needed to do. Now it was up to the system to decide if they were willing to see the truth, or if they would continue to ignore it. As Emily's argument gained momentum, the tension in the courtroom shifted. The air, once thick with certainty, now buzzed with doubt. The prosecution, caught off guard, scrambled to find a way to undermine her. Mr. Thompson's face reddened, his fists clenched in frustration as he stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked. "This is mere speculation. The defendant is stalling." The judge, unmoved by the outburst, glanced at Emily. She met his gaze steadily, her composure unbroken. Emily's heart raced, but she knew she couldn't stop now. This was her moment. She took a step forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. "It's not speculation," she responded, each word deliberate, gaining strength. "It's the truth." Without hesitation, Emily reached into the folder on the table beside her and pulled out a single screenshot. She held it up for the judge and the jury to see, her hand steady. The image was clear, a conversation between the supposed victim and a third party, the words unmistakable. The conversation revealed a premeditated plot to frame Emily, a detailed scheme to manipulate the digital evidence that had been used against her. The courtroom went dead silent. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback. The collective gaze shifted from the screen to Emily, then to the prosecutor, who now looked visibly shaken. The reality of what Emily had just presented was undeniable. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy her life. Her classmates, the very ones who had once rallied behind the victim's story, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They exchanged uneasy glances, some leaning forward, others recoiling. Confusion spread like wildfire. Was this really what had happened? Had they all been wrong? Emily could see it in their faces, the dawning realization. The doubt was spreading. Her quick thinking, her refusal to remain silent, had turned the tide. The truth was unraveling, thread by thread, and it was all because she had seen something others hadn't. While everyone else had been too focused on the noise, Emily had noticed the quiet inconsistencies, the subtle clues. She had been listening to the silence, not just the words. Mr. Thompson's usual confident demeanor had disappeared. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers tapping restlessly on the table. He had no immediate rebuttal, no prepared defense for this revelation. He had believed that Emily was cornered, that the case was airtight. But now, the foundation of his entire argument had begun to crack. Judge Miller, his expression unreadable, glanced at the prosecution's table, then back at Emily. His face, usually stern and unyielding, betrayed a flicker of disbelief. It was clear to everyone in the room. The case against Emily was crumbling. The pieces of the puzzle no longer fit. The prosecution had built their case on faulty evidence, and now it was all falling apart in front of them. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the audience processed what had just transpired. Emily, for a brief moment, allowed herself a flicker of triumph. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. She had just changed the game. Judge Miller took a long pause, his eyes scanning the room. His gavel hovered in the air, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. No one dared speak. Finally he spoke, his voice slow, almost reluctant. "The court will take a brief recess." The words echoed in Emily's mind, a mixture of relief and disbelief. She had done it. Against all odds, against every expectation, she had turned the tide. The courtroom, once a place where her guilt seemed inevitable, was now a place of uncertainty. As the murmurs grew louder and the jury filed out, Emily sat still, her mind racing. What came next? Would this be enough to clear her name? Or had she only just begun a new battle? But for now, at least, Emily had forced the truth into the light, and that was a victory in itself. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the sound of Judge Miller clearing his throat snapped the courtroom back into focus. His voice, steady but laden with the weight of the moment, cut through the tension. "Ms. Johnson, you've provided a compelling argument. I need a moment to review the evidence." The room held its breath as the judge slowly retreated to his chambers. Emily felt the gaze of every single person in the room upon her. Skepticism, doubt, even pity, all mixed with a new sense of curiosity. The quiet buzz of whispered conversations filled the air, but she couldn't focus on them. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the final moments of her argument, still reeling from the shock of what had just unfolded. She had fought, and now it felt as if the world had paused, waiting for the inevitable judgment. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Emily sat motionless, the weight of the courtroom pressing down on her shoulders, her heart racing with anticipation. Her thoughts were a blur, unsure whether to feel hope or to brace for disappointment. She had given everything, but was it enough? Was the truth really going to win out over everything else? Then the door to the judge's chambers creaked open, and Judge Miller stepped back into the courtroom. His expression was unreadable, a mask of professionalism that gave nothing away. The air thickened with expectation as every eye in the room shifted toward him. "The court finds the defendant not guilty due to insufficient evidence," he declared, his voice firm and final. The words landed like a thunderclap. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She had done it. The weight that had been crushing her chest lifted, replaced by a surge of overwhelming relief. She hadn't been wrong. She hadn't been guilty. The courtroom erupted into stunned murmurs. The air, once heavy with accusations, now buzzed with disbelief. Emily's parents, who had sat motionless throughout the trial, their faces etched with the quiet despair of those who had already lost, were suddenly wide-eyed, mouths slightly agape. They stood, frozen in shock. Emily had done the impossible. With nothing but her sharp mind, her refusal to back down, and an unshakable belief in the truth, she had outsmarted them all. The prosecution, the judge, the courtroom full of skeptics, they all thought they had her cornered. But Emily had turned the tables, exposing their lies and manipulation. The murmurs around her grew louder, but she could barely hear them. Her victory wasn't just a legal one. It was personal. She had fought for her future, for her reputation, for everything she had worked so hard for. And she had won. Judge Miller, ever the stoic figure, remained silent, his face still unreadable. But Emily saw it, the brief flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. He couldn't deny it. She had won, not just by the law, but by the strength of her conviction. And just like that, the moment she had fought for arrived. Emily Johnson, a 17-year-old girl who had been accused of destroying another's life, had just proven that truth, when pursued relentlessly, could break even the strongest barriers. A teenager had taken on the full weight of the system, defied the odds, and emerged victorious. As she walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the world finally lifted off her shoulders. The stares, the whispers, the doubts, they didn't matter anymore. Emily was free, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the future seemed full of possibility.